Hello and welcome to Abandoned Project. I'm Joe, so I'm going to keep reading my Death of Krypton story. Now, where was I? Oh, right. Laura Van just threw himself against Zod. But sadly, his attempt to help save his son-in-law proved futile, as he managed to grapple for barely a second before he was knocked off of Zod by the indomitable general. Thrown to the ground to the right of the general, he crashed onto his leg only to cry out and then whimper in pure agony as his vision exploded with stars and nearly went black. "Away with you, old man! You'll soon have your turn," Zod snapped, having maintained his grip over Jor-El's throat with one hand, only to sock Lorvan off of him with the other. All that the senior council member had succeeded in doing was distracting him, but such a distraction was enough, with Jor-El having been stretching out his left hand, having chosen to let go of his own blaster in order to take the weapon near him, but it seemed just out of reach, with the scientist straining to reach for it. Not that Zod was distracted, though, the fear that had held him back. Okay, that part makes no sense. That the man sitting on him would notice his last bid. Okay, this paragraph makes no sense. Yeah, I'll admit that was a mistake. I won't bother reading it. It's not making any sense to me. You sometimes need to read these things aloud to be able to understand. It makes no sense when you, like, on a second reading or a third reading. Now, like I said, this is a first rough draft, and a lot of this probably would have been revised and never make it into the final edition. So here we go. With Jor-El not sure if he could grasp it, but as he felt it with the tips of his fingers, he pulled it over a little, only to feel its muzzle, then slid it around a little until he could grasp it from upside down, feeling the trigger with his third finger. "Any last words, Jor-El?" Zod taunted him, with a sadistic grin on his middle-aged face. "Just one." "What?" "Blaster." "Huh?" Then Zod let loose a great scream of pain as a blaster bolt tore through his side, due to his victim's clumsy and highly wild shot. Having been hoping to aim for the man's heart, Jor-El had barely been able to lift the blaster high enough, and had instead ended up shooting through just above the other man's hip. To his relief, though, Zod fell over, off of Jor-El, who finally managed to get air into his lungs. Coughing and hacking, he rubbed and massaged his throat, only to vomit a little in a flurry of pain and agony as he struggled to suck in enough air to appease his burning lungs, so long abused with a lack of air and oxygen over the past minute or two. His face soon regained its original coloration, rather than the almost sickly blue that it had started to take for several minutes. He lay there, barely breathing, as he soon noticed Ursa's distraction, only to try to aim, but his vision was blurry. Still, though, he managed to squeeze off a shot, which went wild, with Ursa roaring back, only to be tripped by Non, who had regained consciousness. Soon the two of them were wrestling for her blaster, a battle which soon went her way, but by then Jor-El's vision had returned. Unable to properly think, still, he simply impulsively squeezed off a shot at the woman straddling his friend, preparing to kill him, only to graze her shoulder. A cry of pain, then a punch to the face, and Non soon had the blaster, only to let loose a shot through her left leg. Stunned by the fall of their leaders, the rest of the soldiers were soon mopped up by a few careful shots from the reinforcements that Jor-El hadn't even noticed arriving, courtesy of Gal Dorn, who had apparently been hiding nearby somewhere. Soon, though, the weapons on Zod's men suffered technical failure, as Brainiac weighed in at long last, saving Jor-El's life as several of the guards had shots lined up on him, and Laura Van, and even Non, and two other ruling council members. It was a bewildering moment, as a dozen blasters died, with their owners staring or gaping in shock, only to look up at the gargantuan screen behind them. But the screen betrayed no emotion, with Brainiac speaking only now, so that Jor-El jumped a little, having forgotten that he was technically there throughout it all. He never could have imagined being grateful to the AI, but he momentarily was, and then he felt his gratitude die as he glowered at it a little. The the memory of all those who had died still fresh in his memory. Arrest the traitor. Whoops. Wrong character. 1 second. Jet's wanting me to worship. Dogs should be taken care of. Alright, so. Arrest the traitors. Arrest General Zod. Brainiac boomed in his neutral, placid voice, as Zod staring up at Brainiac in stupefied shock, despite his injured sight. Jor-El! Laura Van murmured, weak and tired from where he had fallen. I'm fine. Sorry to disappoint you. Jor-El grunted back as he tried to regain his feet, only to be helped up by one of the guards he hadn't learned the name of. We saved him, sir. You were amazing! The man breathed, awe in his voice. Thanks, but the real work was done by you and by Hathkarn, he replied weakly, grateful for the assist as he desperately needed it. Where is he? His tactical support in marksmanship was most helpful. I could not have accomplished anything without him. Sir, was the murmured hint, with Jor-El turning his head to find a semicircle of security guards standing over a corpse. No! Jor-El gasped, horror filling him as tears threatened to spill out of his eyes. He could not believe it. Hathkarn had been alive but mere minutes ago. The man had heroically done all he could to save Krypton, and this was his reward? It was too cruel. How? Ursa took him out with a shot to the heart, someone explained, but their voices sounded distant to his ears as he grieved. He hadn't known the man at all, or at least not all that well, and yet he had seen in the little time they had spent together a man with a sense of humor, a sense of duty and honor unparalleled by any on Krypton, save perhaps Non, Astra, and Lara. Hathkarn was a martyr and hero, the likes of which Jor-El and Lorvan couldn't hope to aspire to, so much as touch the feet of. Jor-El couldn't later deny that he did fall to his knees, weeping brokenly over the dead guard, the deceased friend he had made, all to end the madness of one man's ambitions. It all felt so futile, so pointless. Why had so many had to die for something so minuscule as greed? Hathkarn deserved a hero's funeral, he told himself, and he would make sure that the man got one, that his death wasn't in vain, and that Krypton's sons and daughters marched on in his name. Jor-El swore this in that moment, just as he felt a hand come to rest upon his shoulder. Looking up blearily, he saw that it was Non. The expression on his face was as sore in spirit and filled with grief as his own was. Little did they know that, before the week was out, there'd be 2 more casualties, and that Jor-El was in for even more pain than before. They got a hint of who it would be a heartbeat later, as the leader of the ruling council pointed in their direction. Seize him! By Rao, seize the traitor! You've missed one, guards! The guards shared a confused look, with another 2 council members rolling their eyes and pointing out who it was they spoke of. Arrest the traitor, Non! Non was arrested, with Astra soon afterwards, with Jor-El once again hating Lorvan and wishing he had let the council die. In their folly and madness, they had hunted down Astra, with Lorvan giving her location away and doing what he could to clear Lara and Kal-El's names, and by extension Jor-El's. It was an intolerable situation for the loyal scientist, who was called forward to stand before the ruling council, who had their stoic snobbery back into place, as they loomed over him on their podium, with Non already there, standing before him, cuffed, with Astra next to him. Since the other day, Jor-El hadn't made it back home, and therefore had not been expecting her to be present for today's meeting, with the father of Kal-El maneuvering his way to stand by Non's side. What is Astra doing here? He asked, confused, glancing from one member of the couple to the other, then the ruling council. She is apparently on trial for not having reported my part in the coup, Non explained, depressed. His eyes had no light, no hope, something that frightened Jor-El, for he had never seen his friend fall so far. Which they would have punished me for due to my betrayal against my husband, Astra complained bitterly. Have you tried contacting your... sorry. I got my characters mixed up. Have you tried contacting your sister? No, because she just worsened the vote, the shrew. Astra retorted with even more bitterness than her previous comment. Do you know why you 3 have been called here? before us! The head of the council thundered, a scowl on his old clean-shaven face. No, Jor-El said honestly, only to glance over at his friends in confusion. He hadn't been allowed to go back home, since the ruling council wanted him close by, in order to call upon him when the time came. The head and Lorvan shared a glance, before the latter explained to Jor-El, Non has been stripped of his position on the council, and is on trial, as is Astra. This isn't just, Jor-El burst out, waving a hand to signal to his friends, unable to understand why this was happening. Punish Zod and his ilk, not Non or Astra. It was they who alerted me to the plot Zod and Brainiac had in mind, and... We have already heard this nonsense about Brainiac, interrupted one of the members, the only female one, who was every bit as corrupt and pompous as her fellow council members, and was thus just as hated or resented by the people of Krypton as her compatriots were. Well? Be silent, Jor-El! The punishment has already been decided. Then what is the point of a trial? Jor-El rebuted, unable to see what the rulers of Krypton were thinking. The point of a trial is to ascertain guilt, Jor-El, Brainiac remarked with a hint of condescension in his neutral voice, something that made the Kryptonian glower at him with utter contempt. Alright, let's see. Was momentarily distracted by the dog. He couldn't really counter the AI, couldn't argue against it. And yet he still tried. He had to protect Non, had to defend the honor of Astra. But they were more than friends. They were family to him. But it is Brainiac who joined forces with Zod to... What a ludicrous motion, said one member of the council. One sec. And, alright. Sorry, the dog's really being bratty today. Alright. What a ludicrous notion, said one member of the council. Then how do you explain the security failure around the building? Jor-El retorted evenly. It was simple. Zod managed to hack and pierce security despite my best attempts to keep him out. Brainiac explained with what may have passed for a shrug for him. Not even Lord Van raised an eyebrow doubtfully against the AI. Instead, he gazed at Jor-El with something akin to pity and a touch of frustration mixed in there. He wished Jor-El would drop the matter of Brainiac, as all it did was destroy the man's own credibility, especially when Lord Van had argued as best he could against the ruling council's decision. It was so cruel, so evil in nature, that his soul had shriveled away from it, even as he thought to himself that Zod would have been more merciful, and that madman had already been cast into the Phantom Zone, alongside the bulk of his surviving followers, although Mala had been promised a slightly commuted sentence, which served only to confuse Lord Van, who didn't trust her despite her pleas of having been forced into the coup. The verdict is this. You, Non, stand accused and shall have your mind damaged so as to be unable to think up this sort of treachery ever again, even as your tongue is cut out to keep you from speaking out against us ever again, one of the council members declared proudly, looking to the others for approval, to which he received it from all of them, save for Lord Van, but he didn't exactly broadcast his feelings, as he knew the price of defiance and was scared. They had all but threatened the same fate to him, should he speak out against it a little too vehemently, and Brainiac had weighed in favor of the punishment, because of course it did. The severity of the sentence took the wind out of both Jor-El's sails and from his lungs as he gaped in shock at the ruling council, incapable to believe that this was the government he had just saved, and that it could be so callous, so cruel. He stared when he should have been defending his friends, but the next part made him flush with pure rage. Further, as Astra failed in her duties and none should be punished, she will die and he will watch, the head of the council pronounced proudly, if indifferently, his cold gray eyes scanning those who stood before him. You can't! Jor-El snapped furiously as Astra and Non froze where they stood. You want to watch your tone, Jor-El, Lord Van warned, his voice almost pleading as he licked his lips nervously, aware of how the ruling council would take his outburst. No! To punish them after they saved you makes you far in a way worse than Zod could ever be. Have you no idea of just how much Non and Astra have done for you? You filthy, hypocritical! That is enough, Jor of the House of El. One more outburst like that and you will be ejected from this hall, until such a time as you have calmed yourself enough to be reasonable. There is no reason in this. Please, my lords, don't punish Non. Give me his punishment, Astra pleaded, throwing herself onto her knees, keen to save her husband from what was, in essence, a fate worse than any death she or her friend could ever imagine. But the council remained stony in the face of their pleading, save for one or two who looked as though they were enjoying themselves, and for Lorvan, who looked away, his face filled with shame, but too cowardly to stand up for what was right and to use his influence to do the right thing. Astra soon broke down, wailing and pleading until Brainiac took control of the situation. Guard number 37281. Kill Astra Inzi now. What? This was half of the people in the hall who spoke up, and the guard didn't question. Raising his blaster rifle, he fired upon the room with a hole soon forming in her head as her brain splattered across the floor alongside her blood. Brainiac! What have you done? Jor-El exploded at once, horror and near hysteria in his voice once he had found it. Again, simple. She was to be executed. The trial was finished, and no amount of pleading could help her. Such is the price of failure and incompetency, Brainiac said in his emotionless dulcets. His indifference in the face of death, such a force that several of the guards shared nervous glances, even as Lord Van gaped, only to vomit. None of their reactions could be compared with Non. At the sound of the order, he had tried to move, but chained as he was to the ground, he could do nothing more than watch. That was when he began to wail out his wife's name, unable to believe what had just taken place. To the wife he had doted upon for so long and so lovingly. As one, they glanced up at the guard, and much as Jor-El would have liked to charge the man, he knew that any clash between them could only result in his defeat and death, with Non destroyed and the council determined to ruin and destroy him also. Astra! Astra, speak to me! No, she can't be dead! Non wailed, brokenly, stuck in place by his chains as he wailed and wept and pleaded with the ruling council, who remained as emotionless in return as Brainiac was. It was then that he made a suggestion that occurred to him earlier, after the council ordered the sobbing Non away. Captain, would you take Non away in order to process him and prepare him for the Phantom Zone? I will see to the Oh, whoops, I thought it was a guard for a minute. I will see to the cleaning of the floor, Brainiac announced as several of his robots hurried along to start erasing any trace of Astra's death in that room. Wait! Jor-El cried out, only to swallow a little. I demand the right of substitution. Let me take Non's place. You would allow yourself to be lobotomized and thrown into the Phantom Zone? Lord Van demanded incredulously, goggling at him with an expression filled with disbelief. There were few things that frightened Jor-El more, and while a part of him hoped they would reject his offer, that voice was a quiet one, overwhelmed by his love for Astra and Non, his friendship with them, and 2 decades of working with them, as well as his outrage over the death of Astra, with the scientist aware that she would have wanted him to do all this, all in his power to protect her husband. If that meant taking the fall for him, in order to shield him from the worst of his fate, then so be it. Jor-El eyed one of the blasters that the guard nearest him was holding. It was tempting to try to take it. To free Non. That would only place his own family in jeopardy, and he couldn't do that. He had to pray and hope that this would be ratified. He was destined for disappointment, though, as he discovered a second later when the ruling council spoke up again. Denied! You are a hero. He a traitor. You shall be rewarded, and he punished further. Nonsense! This rescue and counter coup could not have been successful, were it not for Non. You can't do this to him, you filthy monsters. If you do this, you'll be even worse than Zod, Jor-El cried out, tears springing to his eyes, even as he glowered at them. Jor-El, control yourself, and mind your tongue! Lord Van snapped furiously, fearful for his daughter and grandson, and genuinely afraid, and therefore reluctant to resist the ruling council on this matter. Jor-El glared back, with the ruling council mystified by his desire to take Non's place. That mystification saved his life. It was ironic, because had they known how serious he was and understood it, they may have either relented or allowed him to do so. It was on his end, though, an impulsive act, and one that was filled with pure loyalty and love, sentiments that were quite frankly beyond the understanding of the cruel council. As true politicians, bred for domination, and yet spoon-fed and neutered mentally after a lifetime of Brainiac managing everything for them, they could no more imagine kindness than they could understand their own administration. So dependent upon their AI had they become. Only Lord Van, who had climbed up to his position, could well understand, could fathom such things. Not to say that he would do anything, which made him infinitely worse in some ways, as he not only understood the act he had undertaken against Non-Mastra, and yet he had refused to do anything for fear. Fear for his family, true, but there was a greater fear. Fear for himself and of loss of position. Thus was Non sentenced to the worst fates that Krypton could conjure forth. A hero condemned for his heroism and goodness. A man too good for vile, indolent Krypton. A man better in 1,000 ways than any other politician on our planet, and yet sentenced as though a heretic, as though a monster. No, you will not do so, but you will watch in order to carry on the message that none defy Krypton, another of the ruling counselors proclaimed proudly, with a gleam in his eyes that suggested he expected a thank you from the scientist. What? Jor-El choked out, barely able to keep his resentment and outrage out of his voice and off his face. In that moment, he hated them all. Hated them with a burning passion that easily surpasses odds. And in that moment, if he could have traveled back in time to stop himself from stopping Zod, he would have. This was simply too much, with Jor-El forcing himself to think as he spoke out. Can I go see him? Negative, Brainiac cut through. You are close to him, and therefore likely to aid and abet him. Excuse me, you bucket of bolts, but the people are talking. Brainiac has spoken, Jor-El. He speaks with our voice. The female counselor objected in a haughty voice as she shot him a disdainful look, clearly thinking him an ingrate, when the reverse was true. This isn't over, he swore to himself, full of hate and anger, as he went to leave the hall, as silent as death itself, and vowing that Astra didn't die for nothing. He would save Non, no matter the cost. He had to. As he went to leave, though, the ruling council's leader spoke up from behind him, his words echoing in the hall with far more force and strength than he had any right to sound. One other thing, Jor, of the House of El. We are not wholly incapable of gratitude. You are a hero, unlike Non or Astra, or even Zod. We'll see to rewarding you once you have calmed yourself and accepted the higher wisdom of the ruling council. It seems just and fair to me, Brainiac commented approvingly, to the pleasure of the ruling council, who immediately voted in favor of a boon because of the AI's agreement. He says jump, and they ask how high. Bitterness doggedly followed after the husband of Lara, as he tried to leave, was forbidden only to resign himself to stay in the building. He had hoped to be able to get Lara's help, or maybe assistance of several of Astra's many friends, since despite her husband having been the most popular man on the planet, she had made many friends due to her beauty, warmth, and goodness. As he wandered the halls, aware that Non's punishment would take place in several hours, thanks to one of the security guards who had served under him during the coup, Jor-El formed a plan. First, he looked for the supply closet where officer uniforms could be found. After having found one, he headed for the cell where Non was being held. Having been able to talk one officer into revealing the location, he didn't bring the uniform with him. With this information in mind, he went straight there, having to drop down 300 floors via the turbolift, and then from there had to use a hovercraft in order to get there so as to not tire out his legs. He was almost near the core of the ruling building. It was just a few floors shy of where Brainiac managed his whole network, where the AI truly resided. And it was tempting to stop by there, but he had other business. He had a friend to help. Upon arrival, he found two officers there. One of them shot him a startled, if cautious look, clearly familiar with him, while the other shot him an indifferent, neutral one. The second one spoke first. Halt, civilian. Name your business and purpose for being here. I'm here to see Non on scientific business, Jor-El said stoically, or as stoically as he could. He was nervous, and hoped that none of the desperation and grief showed in his eyes. Grief for Astra, and desperation to do what she would have done, save his best friend from a fate worse than death. The guards seemed unimpressed, but Jor-El was no fool. As he studied them, he waited with bated breath, holding another lie in hand as he added, Lord Van, in particular, wants to know what he knows. Non's a scientist? One of them asked skeptically, to the astonishment of the hero of the hour, with the man gaping at the guard, even as the first guard also gaped at his peer in equal stupefaction to him. I cannot believe you wouldn't know that. It isn't important to guard duties. Still. Anyways, can I go in or not? Jor-El demanded impatiently, having no time for the incompetency of these two guards and their feuding. His keenness wasn't something he bothered to hide, but disguised as it was, he studied the two of them waiting with, but undisguised as it was, he still took the time to study the two of them waiting with bated breath. Sorry, I misread it for a moment. My brain was elsewhere. He knew that any other man would have put on a disguise, but Jor-El knew that he'd be given away instantly. Not to mention, he had a feeling Brainiac would instantly alert everyone to the truth. Not, the first one said firmly, but in his eyes there was a slight hesitancy present. Then you'll need to speak to Lord Van, he informed him sternly, reaching for the comlink on his belt. This was a bluff. He was counting on the guards not wishing to deal with the ruling council, especially given how most guards were either executed or exiled from duty in Krypton when called up by one of the counselors. The Security Council tended to be far more lenient with its own members, but like all other castes, it was subject to the ruling council's authority, more in some ways than given that they were the ones keeping the ruling council safe alongside Brainiac's combat robots. The two guards shared a nervous set of looks, uncomfortable and unwilling to suffer the fate most did when brought to the attention of a ruling council member. In desperation, they tried to hide behind protocol. He's the top prisoner. You need at least 2 ruling council members or Brainiac behind you. Then in that case, 1 minute. I'll also contact my father-in-law's good friend, Val Drar, who's also on the... Okay, but not a word to anyone, one of them said, caving in while the second guard shook his head a little, clearly certain that this was a bad idea. Not that either of them spoke of it at any greater length. They both wanted this over and done with Jor-El giving them a strange smile as he strutted past them, his hands almost shaking from anxiety as he was unused to lying and wasn't terribly talented at it, or at playing these sort of games. Now, I'm going to leave you there as, well, the story is pretty much done. So if you like this video, like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment. Well, done for today, I mean.